All right. Well, super excited for this talk. Neuroscience is near and dear to my heart. Very interested, and I think it's actually a really important realm in the space of workplace peace and conflict that I don't think gets enough attention, but it's starting to emerge more. So it's really important. Dr. Melinda Burrell is a senior conflict transformation practitioner and researcher with 25 years experience leading peace building programs in conflict and post-conflict zones in the US and around the world. She has a specialty in the neuroscience of conflict and communication. She's a syndicated writer on peace and conflict. She has a PhD in conflict analysis from Nova Southeastern University and has successfully helped individuals and groups in rebuilding conflict and creating strong, authentic partnerships through trust and peace processes. I will hand it off. Please feel free to add anything else, Melinda. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it off to you now.
Terrific. Okay. I will, first of all, I want to thank you and the rest of your team for inviting me to this and putting on what I've had a chance to sit in on a number of sessions, and I found them just to be wonderful. So thank you very much for that. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen with the understanding that sometimes my technological capacities are more challenged than I would like to admit. I put this on view. Great, here we go. Just basically, as you heard from the introduction, I've been a manager and a leader of teams for a long time, longer than I realized. But also more recently, I have turned to do a lot more writing and thinking and speaking and training on the neurobiology of communication and conflict. And so workplace conflict is just a fascinating area for me, sort of marrying two of my interests. I thought that perhaps we could start, if you all are able to drop into chat, just some ideas of where is it that you, in the processes and situations that you face in a workplace context, where is it that you typically find increased tensions or disagreements or conflict? I'm going to see if I can see that. There we go. So while you all are thinking of it, I know that for me, one place that I have found it, not only within myself, but also within colleagues, is around the issue of feedback, whether it's formal feedback through a performance review process, or it could be sort of the informal feedback that can come when you're having a meeting and one person says something and the other person reacts to it. That often is where there can be a lot of tension. Let me just go ahead and get moving along a little bit. So 3 things that I want us to cover. And what I'll be doing is using some tools and sharing some tools and some formulas that I have found as I've been doing the research around the neurobiology of conflict and communication that I frankly use every day. They really are wonderful lenses through which I can look at not only professional situations, but also personal situations. And the first one is, let me get rid of this bar. The first one is, essentially it's a formula to help us think about how we can create the happy, productive workplaces that we are seeking. And this will lead then into brain basics, which is just a very, very quick synopsis of what's going on in our brains and bodies as we are trying to communicate with each other and to build trust and to navigate conflict. And then finally, I'll segue into another formula that I really, really appreciate that allows us to explore what is it about our very social nature. How can we understand the neurobiology of our social nature to be able to, again, keep working towards these happy and productive workplaces. So I will slide right into priming positivity, and it's something called the magic ratio. And it comes from a 2004 psychological experiment by the University of Washington. And a psychologist by the name of John Gottman and his team were looking at married couples' interactions. And so they observed many couples and jotted down notes about how they were interacting. And after a while, they began to create a hypothesis, which they were able to prove. And what they found was that for couples, there seemed to be this magic ratio of positive interactions to negative interactions. And couples who had 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction were the ones who could make the long distance. 6 years later, they were the ones who were still married. The ones who had fewer positive interactions for the 1 negative interaction ended up becoming divorced or separated. And what this gets to is the fact that we as human beings, we're wired to focus on the negative. Quite frankly, that's been what has helped to keep us alive, is understanding, paying more attention to the threats that are coming our way rather than the happier moments around us. That's just simply been a survival mechanism. And this experiment and these findings created such interest that they actually have been repeated many, many times. And people have been examining not only married couples, but also workplaces and sports teams and things like that. And what they found is that this ratio pretty consistently holds. Some of the studies have shown that actually in a workplace setting, it requires even more, 6 positive interactions for every 1 interaction. And I do want to clarify that by interaction, it's not like it's a date night in a couple setting. Interaction are really sort of the evanescent moments of communication. So it's positive interactions are just a shared smile, a shared laugh or a joke, or a quick compliment, or in more sort of intimate settings, maybe just a pat on the shoulder, a hug, things like that. But it also means that the negative interactions are just as evanescent. And they can be things that you don't even realize that you're doing, or that you're perceiving. The roll of the eyes in the meeting, or a sort of a derisive comment or something like that. But anyhow, that's something that I just really enjoy thinking about. And actually just yesterday, I was talking about this for a presentation to a board that I'm working with. This is just having this in mind is sort of like the golden rule of building up those goodwill stores, so that when you do have the eventual miscommunication or something, instead of getting into attack mode, you're able to say, that seems kind of uncharacteristic for so-and-so. Let me ask about that and make sure that I understood what they were intending. So that's just one of the formulas that I found that I just really enjoy and find applicable almost everywhere. So this takes us into brain basics and system 1 and system 2 thinking, which in some of the other sessions that I've been listening in on, I've heard references to it. And system 1 and system 2 is essentially about the different ways in which we process information, process and respond to information. And it's about, based on the fact that our human brains have limited processing capacity. And so because of this, we simply aren't able to take in and process all of the information that's coming to us at every single moment from our senses, and also just internally, thinking about what's happening internally in our bodies. So this dual processing system, basically, there's system 1, which is described as the fast system, the hot system. And it's intuitive and it's linked to our limbic system. So it's about sensory input. And it's basically designed to quickly assess a situation that could be potentially threatening in order to keep us alive. And then system 2 is different. This is the one here that's on the frontal lobe. And this is, it's the slower system. It's characterized as a cooler system. It's the one that processes information slowly and rationally and analyzes things. And it's primarily the prefrontal cortex, which interestingly is the last part of the brain to develop. It usually isn't fully developed until we're in our essentially early 20s. So that's an interesting way to think about the teenage years and the decisions and behaviors that we're making when we're that age. So just to give a little example of how this works, in terms of how system 1 sort of helps to filter out the information that isn't quite so worthy of our attention and elevate the information that is, you probably are not usually very aware of the feeling of the clothes that you're wearing. But if you start to get a little cold, then suddenly that will come to your attention and you'll think, yeah, I put on a short sleeve shirt when I really need to be wearing a sweater. And so that's a very mild example of how issues that are new or surprising or potentially threatening, worthy of attention, go from system 1 sort of intuitive automatic understanding to the rational analytical capacity of our brains. So one of these, system 1 and system 2, another thing to understand about them is that they tend to operate on a continuum, and the more one system is engaged, the less the other system is engaged. The more we are engaged rationally, the less open to the information we are coming from our senses. The opposite is true as well. The more we are involved in our emotions, whether positive or negative, the less rational capacity we have. And when I first was sort of coming across this concept, I had just had lunch and I love chocolate. And so I popped a piece of chocolate into my mouth as I was heading back to my office, just thinking about, okay, what are the things I want to accomplish this afternoon? And by the time I got to my office, I realized I had not tasted a single of the calories I had just ingested. And so I realized, all right, next time I'm going to be more mindful when I'm putting that chocolate in my mouth so that I actually do fully enjoy it. And sort of, so these two systems sort of seesaw back and forth, depending on the situation. But there are moments when, bring this down, there are moments when we get a little bit out of whack. And I think that probably people have heard of amygdala hijack. And those are moments when we the amygdala, which is the part of the brain which is very sensitive to threats, senses a threat, a very high threat, and we're flooded with emotions. And here's a listing of some of the emotions. And as you can see, our rational capacities are disabled. And that's, you can think of the phrase, I was so angry I couldn't see straight. I think that we all have had moments where we have experienced this, and so we understand. And that gets back to my point about feedback. I remember one of the times in the workplace where I experienced this most particularly was I was a new-ish director of a team, and it was my first time experiencing an internal audit. And I got the report and was looking at the recommendations and saw the long list of them, and I had an amygdala hijack. I was no longer able to look rationally at that list. Felt like my professionalism was being challenged, and I sensed a threat. And I, put it aside and went home and had a good night's sleep and came back and read it the next morning. It was fine. It was a generally good report. These were just essentially great suggestions. But in that particular moment, I had sensed a threat to my professionalism and possibly to my job. And I had not been able to sort of rationally think through that moment. So I want to go on from talking about amygdala hijacks to other. It takes us into a discussion of exactly how social situations can be perceived as threats by us. There actually has been some, within the last 10 years or 15 years or so, there's been increasing understanding that the same brain circuits that register threats in physical situations also register threats in social situations. And this, again, sort of as you can see on the diagram here, this also is related to the fact that we are hardwired to focus more on the negative things than on the positive things. And so the threats are really more often, can often be very easily triggered. So there is, some of you may have heard of the leadership management thought leader, David Rock, and he was very interested in this concept. And so probably maybe about 15, 20 years ago now, he interviewed 150 different neuroscientists just about this, trying to understand more about the threat response in social situations and how humans do that. And he ended up distilling what he heard from them into this formula. It's called SCARF. And SCARF stands for 5 social situations in which our the threat and rewards, the threat and reward circuits can be activated depending on how that situation is going for us. And basically, this is again getting back into the continuum between system 1 and system 2. If our threat responses are triggered in any one of these social situations, and I'll describe them to you shortly, that puts us into amygdala hijack territory. We become emotional, we may shut down, we may fall back on old behaviors, and we lose much of our capacity for rational thought. Whereas if we're in these social situations and we're feeling rewarded and our reward circuits are being triggered, then we're feeling relaxed and we're feeling open and we're feeling able to think creatively and to collaborate with the people that we're with. Again, that being sort of the ideal scenario that we have been talking about throughout this summit. So let me just sort of walk through these 5 different social situations. Status. It's not actually about something like a social hierarchy status. This is more about, do people see me as a human? Do people see me as someone worthy of respect? Someone who has an equal right to being in the room as everyone else. And I actually saw this in operation. Again, one of my earlier jobs, I was running a field office. I used to do humanitarian assistance work, and I was in Bosnia, and I had a team of about 8 Bosnians. And about 6 months after I had joined the team and taken over as office director, the secretary told me, Mindy, we were really quite skeptical of you when you started working with us. And it turns out the reason was, in that culture, they were very used to authoritarian bosses who would slam their fist on the desk and order things to be done and put people down if they didn't do it quickly and exactly the way they had been told. And that's just not the way I do things. I was sort of a much more democratic, engagement-oriented leader, and I had been asking people their opinions and trying to foster a good teamwork. And she said, you know what? The office actually is running better than it was before. And I realized, I didn't feel surprised because I knew that this was something that I had created the conditions for people to feel comfortable offering ideas, and they all had great ideas. And so we were able to begin to improve the office processes. But that was just sort of an interesting moment for me of realizing how the social situation and paying attention to issues of status and making sure that you're validating people and making them feel of equal importance can really pay off in a workplace situation. So the next one is certainty. And this is something that I saw an awful lot of, particularly at the beginning of COVID. We are wired to want to have enough information so that we're able to project out into the future. And it was interesting watching different businesses and organizations react to the start of COVID. And I could see that those organizations who, even though they had little information themselves, made an effort to communicate with their workforce and let them know as much as they could. So they might say something like, we know X, we don't know Y, we're investigating Y using these different sources, and we expect to have more information for you in a couple of weeks, but we'll be checking back and giving you periodic reports. The ones who did that ended up having a workforce that was just much more emotionally and rational thinking wise able to contribute. But many other ones who sort of stepped back and said, we don't know, they just contributed to the fear that their staff had. And their staff were not able to step in and help the organization weather these difficult times. Closely related to that is the third social situation, autonomy. And this is our sense of control over events. And there have been studies around this. There was one in 2015, Columbia University, I think it was their public health team. They did a big study of 22,000 employees at various businesses and organizations. And they were testing the hypothesis that it must be the senior managers who experience the most stress in these organizations because they're the ones at the top that got all of the responsibility. But what they ended up finding out is that actually it was the middle managers who had the most stress. And that was precisely because they didn't have enough autonomy. They had a lot of responsibility, but they simply didn't have the same resources and decision-making power that the people at the top of the pyramids had. And so they, absent that sense of autonomy, they were struggling. Moving on then to relatedness. This is, as it sounds, it's that sense of how safe you feel and connected to others you feel. And that again is something that we all have been talking about a lot since COVID and seeing the negative ramifications of the isolation that a lot of people experienced during COVID. And this is another situation where I got to see the flip side when reward circuits for relatedness are set off. I am on the board of an organization, and we had been having monthly board meetings over Zoom for all of COVID. And just last month, we had our first in-person meeting. It was a retreat. And we deliberately chose to put aside a lot of the traditional business agenda items that we normally would cover in this annual retreat. And instead, we focused very much on the relationship building and getting to know each other, and talking about us as a group, and learning more about each other that way. And I was fascinated to see 1 month later, when we once again reconvened for back to the Zoom meetings, just as our normal course of business, how much stronger and more ready, more quickly and creatively we were able to tackle the traditional business agenda items that than we had been before that meeting, because we all felt connected to each other, we felt comfortable to each other, we felt respected, so we were able to think creatively. We also felt some level of responsibility towards each other. So I've noticed that accountability on the board is increasing, because we felt so rewarded. We felt that in that social situation, we did feel that the relatedness that we need to, unlike the many instances of people in our society who are feeling the opposite, who have been feeling isolated or separated from the group because of COVID. The last one is fairness, and that is absolutely what you would think. It is how, feeling how reasonably and how fairly you've been treated. And this makes me think of another situation I was in, where I was managing a team, and one of our team members committed a small but not insignificant ethical violation. And it was significant enough that I did want to remove him from the team. But we were operating in a delicate situation, and he was a very well-connected individual, and my bosses were very reluctant. They were just afraid of what might happen if we fired this man. He was on contract, and so we ended up just letting him work until the end of his contract, which was another maybe 5 or 6 weeks, and then just let him go that way, and did not renew the contract. And so it was sort of an easy parting that way. But at that point, I was talking more with the staff, and at that point, they felt comfortable expressing the fact that they had been angry that this man had been allowed to stay, because they felt like they had sort of been punished. They had been following all the rules. They would not have committed this infraction, yet he did, and he was allowed to stay on. And I just thought that that's yet another, it's an interesting example of not only fairness for the one person, but also fairness for the group, and how that did put the rest of the staff into a position of being worried and afraid. And so I'm really coming to the end of my time here, which is unfortunate. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of these formula with you, because I think that they are things. In fact, let me stop sharing and get to the chat, because they are just formulas and ways of thinking about how to create constructive social situations, both in the workplace as well as in personal situations. And they also it's just a good reminder of how to make sure that we are sort of preventing any unnecessary conflict. I absolutely agree that conflict is good, but if you're able to set up relationships and dynamics so that people feel comfortable engaging and re-engaging with each other when they have disagreements. And I think that the magic ratio and SCARF are wonderful ways to help do that. I think that we are pretty much out of time, but if anybody has any questions or comments, we would love to see them in the chat or have people unmute themselves.
Yeah, please ask. We got about a minute left, but thank you so much, Melinda. It makes me think of this idea that I've been sort of thinking about lately, which is like, we're all just basically these nervous systems that are walking around, and our nervous systems are constantly looking for threats. That's kind of one of the main jobs is like, are we safe? Are we in danger? And what you're talking about is creating relationships and systems around us.
Exactly.
How do we create the types of relationships and systems that can let our nervous systems know that we're safe rather than that we're in danger? That's a really important endeavor.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Again, we're flying through some of these really intense topics, but I think it's actually a great segue into our next topic, which is de-escalation. So, like, once people are in that sort of amygdala hijack, what can we do to help de-escalate the situation? That's going to be our next talk and our final talk of the day. So thank you again, Melinda, and thank you, everybody. Give us about 5 minutes and we will return with de-escalation skills for our final talk of the day.